I almost didn't cover this story. When I first saw the headline, I figured it was the usual diplomatic noise, a press release dressed up as strategy. Then I started reading the actual details, and I had to sit back for a minute. What Mark Carney has just pulled off, or is in the process of pulling off, is something that, if it works, could fundamentally redraw how global trade operates for the next 30 years. And it was triggered, almost directly, by a billionaire bridge dispute that Trump started on social media at 11 o'clock on a Monday night. Let me walk you through all of it, because the bridge story and the 40-nation alliance story are the same story. You just have to see how they connect. The Gordie Howe International Bridge. 6 lanes of cable-stayed steel stretching 1.5 miles across the Detroit River, connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan. It took over 2,000 days to build. It cost more than 6.4 billion Canadian dollars. And here is the critical detail. Canada paid every cent of it up front. Not half. All of it. The arrangement was deliberate. Michigan didn't have the money. The U.S. federal government didn't allocate funds. Canada said, fine, we'll front the construction costs, and Michigan will repay its share through toll revenues once the bridge opens. 50% of net revenues, after Canada recoups its investment. Michigan gets half ownership of the asset. Canada gets repaid eventually. The agreement was signed in 2012 and supported by Trump himself during his first term, who called it a vital economic link between our two countries. Then, on the evening of February 10, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social that he would not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them, and added that the U.S. should probably own at least 1/2 of this asset. Michigan already owns half of it. That's in the legal agreement, in writing. The New York Times later reported that the outburst came after a member of the Moran family, the billionaire owners of the nearby Ambassador Bridge, which has been printing money as the busiest land crossing in North America for decades, met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and spoke with Trump that same day. The Moran family has spent years and considerable political donations fighting the construction of the competing new bridge, the one Canada built, the one Michigan co-owns. So just to be precise about the sequence here, a billionaire donor lobbied the Commerce Secretary, who called Trump, who then threatened to block a binational infrastructure project on social media, based on claims that were factually wrong, that his own administration had contradicted in 2017, and that Michigan's Republican and Democratic governors both pushed back on publicly within 24 hours. This is where Carney's response becomes instructive. He called Trump the next morning. He told him, calmly and on the record, that Canada paid for the bridge, that Michigan already has co-ownership, that American steel and American workers were used in construction. He described the call as positive and said the situation will be settled. He did not panic. He did not escalate. He treated the episode like what it appeared to be, a negotiating pressure point cooked up for reasons that had nothing to do with Canada and everything to do with domestic U.S. politics. And then, that same week, he kept building the thing that matters far more than any bridge, the 40-nation alliance. Here's the context that makes this land properly. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, is a trade bloc that was originally negotiated with the United States as the anchor. Obama built it. Trump walked away from it in 2017 on his first day in office. The remaining 11 nations ratified it anyway, and it eventually expanded to 12, including the United Kingdom. It covers Canada, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Chile, Brunei, and the UK. The European Union needs no introduction. 27 member states, the world's largest single market. Together, those two blocs represent approximately 40 countries, a market of roughly 1.5 billion people. And according to reporting from Politico this week, confirmed by Canadian officials, they are now opening formal talks to explore linking their supply chains, led, championed, and spearheaded by Mark Carney. The technical mechanism at the center of the proposal is something called Rules of Origin Cumulation. This sounds dry until you understand what it actually does. Rules of origin determine a product's economic nationality, which country made it, which country's materials went into it, for the purpose of applying tariffs. Under existing arrangements, a car built in Canada with Japanese parts and German components might face tariffs at multiple points as it crosses different trade borders. Cumulation changes that. If the EU and CPTPP align their rules, a manufacturer inside either bloc can source parts from any member country and still qualify for the lower tariff rates that flow through the combined framework. Supply chains that currently have to be routed carefully around trade barriers could move more freely across 40 countries. Components from Vietnam, assembly in Canada, sale in Germany, all under one unified low-tariff umbrella. The U.S. is not in either bloc. The U.S. is not part of this conversation. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because the talks are early. The enthusiasm inside the EU is mixed. Some officials are reportedly super keen. Others say it's not a current priority. And translating a concept this ambitious into an actual binding agreement is going to take years of work. But the direction of travel is unmistakable, and Carney has already moved from speech to action. His personal representative, John Hannaford, was dispatched to Singapore this month to meet with regional CPTPP leaders and sound out their appetite. Canadian officials are on record saying the discussions are definitely coming along and that they've had very fruitful conversations with partners. Japan has called the idea of origin cumulation an interesting avenue to explore. The EU agreed last year, in the wake of Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, to expand cooperation with CPTPP as a direct counterbalance to U.S. trade fragmentation. This is where I want to stop and ask you something directly. Do you think an alliance like this, 40 countries, 1.5 billion people, no Americans at the table, actually changes the balance of power? Or is this just diplomatic theater that falls apart once the pressure is off? I'm genuinely not sure, and I want your read in the comments. Now zoom out, because this is the part that most coverage is missing. What Carney is constructing is not just a trade deal. It is an operating framework for a world in which the United States is an unreliable partner. That is a sentence that would have sounded paranoid 3 years ago. It does not sound paranoid anymore. And Carney, a man who spent his career studying systemic risk in financial markets, appears to have concluded that the current American posture is not an aberration to be waited out. It is a structural reality to be planned around. The evidence for that conclusion is stacking up in ways that go well beyond tariffs. Canada's military, according to recent reporting in the Chicago Policy Review, has modeled, for the first time in over a century, how it would respond to a U.S. military invasion. The scenario is treated as hypothetical and remote. The results are stark. Canada would be overwhelmed within days, and then forced into a combination of insurgent tactics, drone operations, and appeals to European allies for support. The Canadian government did not commission this analysis as a policy recommendation. It commissioned it because that is what serious security planners do when the strategic environment changes fast enough that old assumptions can no longer be taken for granted. Think about that for a moment. Not the invasion scenario itself. That remains extremely unlikely. Think about the fact that Canada felt it necessary to run the analysis at all. The country that has shared an undefended border with the United States for over a century, that has fought alongside Americans in every major conflict since World War I, that supplies 60% of American crude oil imports and 85% of American electricity imports, that country is now quietly gaming out scenarios in which Washington is the threat. That is a rupture, not a diplomatic disagreement, not a trade spat, a rupture. And it's producing consequences that are practical, not just symbolic. Foreign Policy magazine, in a piece published this week, describes what analysts are now calling the Carney Doctrine, a framework of what Carney calls sovereignty through optionality. The idea is this: a country that depends on a single partner for security, trade, and investment has no real options when that partner turns coercive. A country that has built dense networks across multiple partners can always walk away from one relationship without collapsing everything. That's the logic behind the EU-CPTPP Bridge initiative, behind the 12 new trade deals on 4 continents in 6 months, behind the visit to Beijing, the coordination with Mexico's President Sheinbaum, the meetings with UK Prime Minister Starmer this week on trade and defense cooperation, behind the Buy Canadian procurement policy that is now redirecting what could be tens of billions in federal spending toward domestic suppliers. Carney isn't reacting to Trump. He's building architecture. And the bridge dispute, the tariff threats, the annexation rhetoric, All of it is accelerating the construction timeline. Here is the complication, though, and it's a real one. The EU-CPTPP alliance concept, even if it eventually materializes, solves a future problem. It doesn't solve the immediate problem. Canada still sends 75% of its exports to the United States. That dependency doesn't disappear because Carney gives a speech in Davos or sends an envoy to Singapore. Reshoring supply chains, building new trade corridors, reorienting decades of integrated continental manufacturing, that is generational work. It cannot be done in a single government's term. And critics, including within Canada, are asking hard questions. Conservative MP Michelle Rempel-Garner has challenged Carney to translate vision into specific timelines. Labor groups and security analysts are nervous about the China dimension, worried that opening the door wider to Chinese trade exposes Canadian workers and critical infrastructure to new vulnerabilities. Some European officials are signaling that for all their enthusiasm about the CPTPP initiative in principle, it is not currently their top priority, with their own tariff fights, defense spending pressures, and political turbulence demanding immediate attention. There is also the question of what happens if Trump blinks first. Markets, businesses, and politicians on both sides of the border would feel enormous relief if the USMCA renegotiation this summer produced a stable framework and the worst-case tariff scenarios never materialized. Would that relief collapse the sense of urgency driving Carney's diversification push? Would coalition partners quietly step back if Washington offered better terms bilaterally? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the scenarios that Carney's advisors are presumably gaming out alongside the invasion war games. And yet, Carney made a specific argument at Davos that cuts through this uncertainty. He said, drawing on Finland's President Alexander Stubb, that this moment requires values-based realism. The realistic recognition that power politics is back, that great powers are using economic integration as a weapon, and that middle powers cannot rely on rules or alliances that the powerful no longer feel bound by, but combined with a values-based commitment to building something better rather than simply submitting. The phrase that landed hardest, middle powers must act together because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. What the EU-CPTPP initiative represents is Carney's attempt to build a very large table, large enough that being left off it would actually hurt the country doing the excluding. The U.S. House of Representatives voted on February 12th to overturn Trump's tariffs on Canada. The tally was 219 to 211. Republicans crossed the aisle. It was the first time the House has genuinely confronted Trump over tariff policy, and it signals that even within the United States, the treatment of Canada is generating political costs. The vote will almost certainly be vetoed. It has no chance of becoming law without Trump's signature. But the signal it sends to Carney is important. The domestic U.S. political coalition behind the most aggressive version of the tariff strategy is not as solid as it appears from the outside. That matters for the USMCA renegotiation this summer. Carney goes into that negotiation having demonstrated he can build alternatives, having secured domestic Canadian support across party lines, and knowing that his counterpart is not operating from a position of unanimous domestic backing. The economic argument for a functional Canada-US relationship is strong on both sides. Canada is the top export destination for 36 American states. About $3.6 billion in goods and services cross that border every single day. The political theater of threats and posturing may be obscuring the economic reality that both countries need each other, and that the leaders who figure out how to use that mutual need constructively will come out ahead. Whether Carney can hold the coalition he's building long enough to turn that reality into leverage, and whether the EU-CPTPP alliance becomes a genuine structural alternative or a useful negotiating prop, is the question that won't be answered this spring. But something has shifted that I don't think shifts back. The assumption that the U.S.-Canada relationship is a permanent, unconditional anchor of North American stability, that assumption is gone, on both sides of the border. And the world that replaces it is being built right now, largely by a quiet, methodical, central banker turned prime minister who seems to have decided that the time for polite waiting is over. The 40-nation table is being set. The United States hasn't been invited. Where do you think this actually leads? Does Carney's alliance hold together, or does it fragment the moment Washington offers a better deal? Drop your prediction in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you're reading this.